Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Unknown Nations. I'm your co-host, Mark Young, with our CEO and our fearless leader, Greg Kelley.
This is the Unknown Nations podcast, where we'll be sharing about reaching the nation where Jesus is unknown.
One of the biggest things we need to do to fulfill the Great Commission is we need leaders in these far-flung, unknown nations, unreached nations to do the work, because we can't go over and do all this stuff.
Right.
And even if we did go over there to do it, they wouldn't trust us anyways, right?
Yeah.
In many cases, because we don't look like them.
No, exactly. It takes a cross-cultural leader to be the most effective. They say there's about 2.2 million evangelical churches in the world, and 85% of them are being led by people without any formal training at all. And so you've got this massive gap, and the gap isn't in America. There's one formally trained leader in America for every 250 people. And that number, once you go outside of America, is one trained individual for every 400,000 people. And so the need is not in America. It is about encouraging and raising up these indigenous leaders. That is absolutely the key to fulfilling the Great Commission.
And I find I can get myself bogged down in this too. So sometimes it's fun to look at the Greek origin of a particular word in the Bible, or the Aramaic meaning of a word in the Bible, and to drill down and figure out, okay, what was God saying in this phrase?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's all valuable information. But we need people who understand what John 3:16 is.
Right. Exactly.
So it's not always important that somebody's going to seminary and learning, what the Greek interpretation of a word is, when they don't know the basics of Christianity.
Yeah.
When we have a lack of that. Is that a safe observation to say is what we're trying to do here?
Yeah. I mean,
so what does our training look like?
Yeah, the instruction is to go make disciples. It's not to go make converts. Jesus said in the Great Commission, go make disciples of all nations. So for us, when we invest in these training centers, first of all, you're using these indigenous leaders mainly, and we're not an anti-American organization, but there's probably 60 countries in the world, Mark, that are closed access or limited access. So if that takes 60 of them off the table right away, and those are countries like Iran, Yemen, even parts of northern Nigeria, North Korea, Somalia. Those are very
Afghanistan.
difficult.
Would they be on that list?
Afghanistan, Iran, yeah. I mean, there's even limitation to a place like Pakistan. Now, I can get into Pakistan, but if I start showing up to Pakistan every other month, you're going to get a question on that. You're going to get a call from the government, and they're going to be inquiring. That's the U.S. government. They're going to say, how come you're going to Pakistan so much? So, I mean, it's using the indigenous leaders is the practical approach. Not to mention from a financial standpoint, I think the average American missionary is on the low end, probably $50,000 and all the way up to $70,000. Whereas for a national leader, they can survive on $200 a month. And so it's the contextualization of culture is critical, because if you or I are going to go to Yemen, let's say, for example, even if we could get in there, it's going to take you 4 to 5 years just to learn the language and acclimate to the culture before you can even begin doing ministry. So $250,000 in, now I can just barely start to get used. It's not a great business model, just not a great business model. So the training for us looks like it's all contextualized. If I'm in Pakistan, it's contextualized for a Muslim majority people group, because it's the second most populated Muslim country in the world. If I'm in India or South India, it's going to be mainly contextualized for how do you lead a Hindu person to Christ? How do you deal with Hinduism? If I'm in Myanmar, it's going to be mainly training on, well, you better know who Buddha is, and you better understand the premise, the foundational principles of Buddhism if you're going to be effective in that country. So contextualization is critical as we're training leaders and raising them up.
Now, let me ask you a question, Greg. How do we select the right leaders? How do we decide this person over here is the right person?
So I
How do
think
we know that? I mean,
a
some of
lot,
that is probably just spiritual discernment, but
a
what's the
lot,
key?
a lot of it is. I think when in our discipleship making, a big distinguishing fact is we're mobilizing them right away. And so when someone comes to know the Lord, immediately we say, now the calling of the Great Commission is upon your life. So you're really looking for people to recognize that calling, that I want to go and reach, not just anywhere, but particularly places where the gospel's not been. I'll give you an example. I was in Kenya a few years ago, where, as you know, we do a lot of work. And Kenya is the most evangelical country in the world. So people will ask us, well, unknown nations, why are you working in the most Christian country in the world? And the answer to that is because Jesus didn't call us to countries. He called us to the nations. He called us to the Munya Yaya. He called us to the Barana. He called us to the Somali, that are nations inside of Kenya. And so we were invited, Mark, to a very large denominational semi-annual gathering they had. And they said, we want you guys to share about missions and challenge there was like 250 pastors. So I'm speaking to these 250 Kenyan pastors, and I'm talking to them about people groups that are more in the northern part and the eastern part, because that's where all the unreached people groups are at. People groups that are like the Munya Yaya, that are like the Barana, that are like the Turkana, the Dashanak, and the Somali, of course. And I was thinking, I don't ever need to come back to this country. You guys don't need a visa. You certainly don't need a passport. We'll give you treasures, all the treasures you want.
Yeah, there's 250 of you in this room.
Right? You guys just go. And I'm like, have you heard of these people groups? Have you heard of the Rendili? Have you heard of the Pokat? Have you heard of these guys? And they're kind of looking at us, and they're like, well, we've kind of heard of them. But I'm like, well, how many
And
of
it's
you
right
are
there in
going
their
there?
backyard.
Right in their backyard. It's a little short, day trip for them. They could drive 5 hours.
It'd be like us saying that we never heard of Cincinnati or something, right?
Exactly. But the most disturbing thing is when I asked them, I said, well, raise your hand if you're doing active ministry among them. This is the most evangelical country in the world. And one hand went up out of over 200 leaders. One guy, and that was kind of even an argument of if that was even an unreached people group that he was working with. I was just shocked. And so then I was trying to mobilize them, engage them, and their heart was not in it. So when you say, well, who do you start with? Who do you train? It starts with the heart. It starts with a calling, a conviction that I cannot coexist in the presence of 4 million Somalis who don't have access to the gospel. Not on my watch. I'm going there. But the trick is that so many of these places, Mark, even when you're working with the indigenous leader, you can't just make an assumption. Oh, I know a Kenyan. Let's go reach the Somalis. That's wrong. That's a bad assumption, because you have to make sure that the passion and conviction is there for the calling. Now, once you find that, now you've got something to work with. So it always starts with the calling, and then the person, willing to make the commitment, and the training begins, pour into them. We help them with the resources, and off they go.
I'm looking at my show notes here, and we're really talking about, I think it's Second Timothy 2:2, I believe, is where the tie-in here.
That's the scripture verse. So of course, when we're talking to people about missions, it's the main verses are, what's the assignment? And all of us would, and to some extent probably be able to quote the Great Commission: all authority in heaven and earth is given to me, therefore go make disciples. We always, oh yeah, that's missions conference, or even the Acts 1:8, Jesus' last words, that you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and the ends of the earth. So that's the assignment. But the how you go about that's where 2 Timothy is so powerful. We tell people, this one's easy to remember. You just go 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2. And Paul said...
It looks like my buddy Chuck Woolery there when you were doing the 2 and 2 thing there.
Right, exactly. Mm-hmm. So that verse is super profound, because it talks about the how do you do it? And it's the things you've heard me share in the presence of many witnesses, share with faithful men who will share with others. So you have 4 generations literally of multiplication. That is how 12 men turned into 3 billion. That premise of like, hey Mark, I just shared the good news. I'm gonna tell you the most amazing story in the history of humanity, the redemption that Jesus provided at the cross, the salvation of all humanity through the blood that was shared at the cross. It's a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, when I give you that information, it was never intended to have a period after it, for you just to keep it to yourself. As wonderful of news it is. Now, many Christians do that. Most Christians, when you say, who have you shared the gospel with? They'd be like, what? That's for missionaries. I've never done that. God never
Right.
designed.
I'm not a pastor. I'm not a missionary.
Right. I'm not equipped. I'm not trained. I don't feel equipped to do that. But the Great Commission was not intended for just a certain segment. It was a calling for all of us. Now, it might look different. Some might go, some might pray, some might send, give resources, whatever. But for us, the multiplication is critical in the ground. So I'm sharing to Mark, who, with intentionality, Mark is going to share with someone else, who's going to share with someone else. So it started with Greg, but I might even not know that fourth generation person. And that's a beautiful thing when we see that multiplication happen.